diversity dance company, a queer multiracial dance company that provides affirming and accessible dance education to all LGBTIQQ2S communities. Ravyn is the artistic director of OVA Outrageous Victorious Africans Collective, a dance theater collective that share the contemporary voices of African, Black, queer, self-identified storytellers. So I'm going to now mute myself. Welcome to Syrus and Ravyn. I can't thank both of you enough for the very last minute planning on this. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to McMaster for hosting this conversation. It is such an honor to be able to be part of the Scholars Strike. Ravyn and I are both deeply enmeshed in the movement for Black lives, and we know that, the fight for liberation and the fight for justice, has intensified in the last couple of months, and we're going to talk a bit about that today. So the Scholars Strike is a really encouraging move of solidarity coming from the academic community in support of the movement for Black lives, for Indigenous resurgence, and for justice here on Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut. I'm coming to you, the Syrus, coming to you from Takaranto, from the part of Takaranto that was underwater at the time of the Toronto Purchase and is therefore unceded territory. It is the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So just to acknowledge where I'm coming to you from. Ravyn, do you want to as well?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Ravyn Ariah Wngz. Black Widow of Burlesque. I'm a storyteller. You heard my bio a bit before. I'm also in Takaranto, but on the west side. My work is deeply woven into my identities as an Afro-Indigenous Two-Spirit trans woman. I believe that as an artist, my job is to reflect what is happening, to present options for the future, and to offer hope and ways to move in times where we don't always understand what is happening. So that is me in a tiny little nutshell.
So Ravyn, we together participated in a dialogue and conversation many years ago now for the book Until We Are Free, the reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada, which just came out in 2020, but our conversation was probably 2017 or 2018. It seems like so much has happened since that time, but we had this conversation about activism and art specifically Black arts in the movement. And we talked at that time a bit about what was happening. And I'm so excited to be coming back to this conversation in 2020 as we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic, within a pandemic, in the middle of a revolutionary moment, a revolution. This is such an exciting time to be having this conversation, and so much has happened. So let's just start where we started in 2017. Let's talk a little bit about how we're involved in the movement. So of course, as Stephanie mentioned, both you and I are involved in Black Lives Matter Toronto, but let's talk a little bit about it. Do you want to start? Can you talk a bit about how you're involved in the movement for Black lives?
Sure. I'm involved in the movement for Black lives simply because of my identities. As a trans person, Two-Spirit memory keeper, I've taken it on as my purpose to eradicate the forms of anti-Blackness that plague our communities, right? And for me as an individual, I used art to do that. The way that I came into Black Lives Matter Toronto was through my movement practice, teaching a flash mob and then showing up at rallies and teaching stretching and harm reduction movement exercises for folks, because I saw that people were embodying a lot of trauma, but didn't have a lot of avenues and ways to release that. And so I take that into the way that I organize, into our understandings of censoring disability justice as abolitionists who are working on creating movements of care, of accountability, of justice that is not carceral in logic. These are the things that I focus on as part of Black Lives Matter Toronto. We are, even across the board, we make decisions together. And a lot of what we do is to bring attention to what is happening to our communities, but also to help bring our communities together in ways that aren't always in our defeat and um, in our grief, but also in our joy, in our celebration, in our art making, in our strategies, in our ways of living.
I've muted myself. When we started organizing together was in 2016. That's when we both joined Black Lives Matter Toronto. I had been organizing for many years before. I've been an activist for about 25 years and had really started organizing in Toronto as part of this group called Friends of Move, which was this abolitionist group that was working in support of the Move family in Philadelphia that had been targeted by the police, that they were a Black environmental justice group that had been targeted by the police, had been targeted by the city, so much so that the city famously burnt down 3 city blocks of a mostly Black and working class neighborhood in Philadelphia in order to attack the Move house. So I got involved in organizing through Friends of Move, and then got involved in organizing around Mumia Abu Jamal, who was a Black political prisoner who's still in prison today. And then started organizing through Prisoners Justice Action Committee and other groups, around this idea of abolition. I've also been involved in organizing with Blackness Yes and Blockorama, which is really trying to bring together Black, queer, and trans people in Toronto and beyond to celebrate, as you say, Ravyn, the joy and the amazing things that are happening when we come together and the magic of when we come together. But then we started organizing together through Black Lives Matter, and we found, of course, we both came to this movement through our art practice. So just for people who aren't familiar, talk a little bit about your art practice. You mentioned you are Ravyn Wngz, but you are also the Black Widow of Burlesque. Let's hear a little bit about your artistic practice.
Sure, always happy to talk about that. I'm an embodied movement storyteller, and so what that means is I tell stories from my own personal experiences of navigating the societies where I grew up and see in front of me. Part of that was starting a dance company called Ilnana Diversity Dance Company. We were the first queer multiracial dance company telling stories about our actual lived experiences, our joys, our sensuality, our expressions of vibrant representations of gender, stretching the ideas of what gender is and isn't. And through that, I found myself into burlesque. The burlesque world embraced me at a time where I was really trying to understand what my voice was. As a dancer, we're taught to, as a mainstream contemporary dancer, we're taught to be someone else's idea, someone else's fantasy, to tell someone else's story. And so it's very rare that we actually get to tell our own stories from our own experiences and get to be our full selves on stage. And so burlesque has allowed me to do that in that it's one of the most consensual art forms I've ever been a part of, because I'm in control of what I say, of how I share, what I share, when I share it. Yes, there are aspects of stripping, but as I understand it, it's about revealing parts of yourself. It's not always about what you take off. Sometimes it's about what you put on. That shifts and changes the conversation, that brings people into themselves even. I run a dance workshop with Dainty Smith, who is the Layla Femme Fatale's founder, but also she changed the game for Black and brown, queer and non-binary folks here in Toronto and North America. For burlesque performers, there weren't many before, and she's created quite the platform for each of us to be seen and showcased. And so that's what I do within Black Lives Matter Toronto. it shows up in our actions. It shows up in the colors that we choose. It shows up in the ways in which we choreograph our marches and our conversations. It showed up in the speech that went viral that I did. A lot of that came from my practice of burlesque, learning how to grab the attention of an audience and to bring them into a truth that they were unwilling to see or saw and didn't really understand what they were looking at. So that's me and my work in a nutshell. How about you, Syrus? How do you describe yourself as a vast artist that you are?
Well, I like to do a lot of different kinds of things in my practice. I am a performance artist. I am a theater artist. I write plays. I do performance art, but I'm also someone who's deeply in love with drawing and painting. And I've had the opportunity of to be able to draw you. I often will draw people very large scale, 12 feet, 10 feet tall, larger than life. And as a way of telling stories about the activists in our community, a way of sort of celebrating and supporting activists who are doing work and wanting to make sure that they have the support that they need to continue organizing and to continue working. I also do a lot of speculative fiction work. I'm really motivated by that Tony Cade Bambara quote about making the revolution irresistible. That the role of the artist from the oppressed community is to make the revolution irresistible. And I think irresistible, first of all, is just such a delicious and wonderful word, right? And how beautiful that we could make something as important as the revolution irresistible, right? So what a beautiful idea. So I've been creating political works and speculative fiction works that are set in the near future that help to kind of imagine the world that we're trying to get to. As an abolitionist, as somebody who believes that we could build a world that looks vastly different than it does today, one that, everyone would have housing, everyone would have what they needed to thrive, everyone would have food, everyone would have, the supplies that they needed in order to live their fullest life. And when we start to talk about those dreams, we get told, but what about this? Or, but how would it look like? What would it look like? And how would it be? And people just can't imagine it. So as artists, we get a chance to paint a picture quite literally for people of what the future could potentially look like. So a lot of my artistic practice is rooted in this idea that I'm kind of trying to paint a picture or create a performance that helps you to imagine that we're going to do this together, that we're going to survive this together, that we are going to overthrow white supremacy, that we are going to deal with the ravages of capitalism, that we're going to actually make it, So whether I use drawing, I'm a DJ as well, performance art, lots of different methods, but the same goal, to make the revolution irresistible. So Ravyn, let's talk for a minute. You mentioned it just very briefly in the humble way that you are, but you had a speech that we gave. So for folks who are just sort of tuning into what's happened in Toronto this summer, there was a lot of organizing and activism after the death of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd by the police in the States, but then subsequently the killing and death of Regis Korchinski-Paquette during the presence of the Toronto Police Services during a so-called wellness check. And there was massive protests and demonstrations that kicked off that spread all across Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut, and across the world. And there was this call to defund the police. And there was a lot of organizing that happened around the Defund the Police campaign. For Black Lives Matter Toronto, we created defundthepolice.org, which is a website, .ca is a website with all sorts of information about how you could defund the police and reinvest in communities and reinvest in all the support and services that we needed. And there was all of this activism that happened. So there was, marches, there was demonstrations. We quite famously did a 7,500 square foot mural on the street in front of Toronto Police Headquarters that said defund the police. And then there was also other activisms that happened through the summer. And in one of the a series of activisms specifically targeted at monuments to slavery and colonialism, including the largest monument, which is the police force and prison system in Canada. There was paint that was put onto statues, and 3 people who were in attendance at the protest were arrested. And then the day following that, you gave a speech at a press conference that reminded us about what was actually important, that we were talking about statues when people were dying, you know, that we needed to follow trans leadership in order to make you question your, you know, rigid and you know, dinosaur type ideas about gender. You know, you just gave this beautiful, beautiful speech that would have, I think, dramatically impacted the city and would have dramatically and definitely dramatically impacted everybody who heard it. But then something unexpected happened. Artists, well-known artists, started sharing your speech. And so, you know, Madonna shared it, and Rihanna shared it, and Amy Schumer shared it, and all of these artists, you know, who were trying to engage in a political conversation, shared this work around. I'd love to ask you a little bit about what that process was like and what has happened now in terms of your voice as a platform for using art in the revolution.
Oh, thanks, Sai. Okay, so the speech. I need to talk about the moment just for a moment. It was really rough. I was really frustrated. I was really angry. I was really tired. I was tired of giving these well thought out, laid out processes. I was tired of all the work that we did that went unseen and unnoticed. From the website to all the ways that we've been organizing for years and beyond, and even before I was around. And when we were at that conference, we had been speaking for about 30 minutes before I did that second speech. What's kind of funny to me is that the first part of my speech, the part that was planned, no one really heard that part. But I was really addressing the media who was in front of me. I didn't expect it to do what it did. My purpose was to get them to take responsibility for the way that they report, for what they report, for how they perpetuate and participate in our disenfranchisement by focusing on something that we talked about. We laid out why those people, it wasn't as if we didn't explain it. It wasn't as if it wasn't clear. It was laid out. And for me, they just kept going back.
Bad man, you know, Ryerson was a bad man. You know,
yes.
These were not people to celebrate.
Exactly. And the way that we celebrate these monuments to white supremacy and how we as people of color walk past them and through them all the time with these effects and impacts is unacceptable, right? And so I was just really frustrated. I was shaking. I was ready to jump off the stage. And I was like, I just gotta say this, because I think that people will always say you're protesting wrong. Always, no matter how you protest. And so I had to lay out all the ways that we've done it, from Beyonce and from Black is King to Michael Jackson to Janet Jackson to like people have been doing this, Shaka Khan, Jameson. Everyone has been talking about this, Nina Simone. So if you were ever paying attention to art that came from these communities, which a lot of people profit from now, that's what we were talking about. That's what rap is about. That is where hip hop is about. It's about talking about what happened in the streets, like living and life and how we're surviving. And so that's really where the speech came from. And then something happened where Ovo 40 shared my post, a picture of me, and underneath it, all these rappers saw my picture. It was just a picture. It wasn't the actual video. And they started like very transphobic, very homophobic, very violent comments towards me. And of course, these people didn't know who I was before this moment, but I was tagged. And so all of them knew who I was. And so I was getting all this influx of a lot of violence. I was really upset. I was in a lot of pain over it, despite already feeling like really frustrated with the events of the day before. And then I did an Instagram live. I think it was one of the first ones that I did, where I talked about this comment that someone made, saying that we went from Martin Luther King Jr. to this, referring to me, and how that broke my heart. Because as a 5-year-old living in Atlanta, Georgia, that's who I wanted to be. Knowing that I couldn't be that because I didn't look that part, but I always wanted to do that work. So I thought that the only way I could do that was as an artist like Michael Jackson, Janet Jackson, which is why I chose this sort of avenue. So when Madonna shared it first, I was shocked. I didn't know what to say. And then bunches of people started sharing it. Tracy Ellis Ross, people who I look up to. But what really struck me was Amanda Seales shared my Instagram video, but then also did her own sort of like a 2-minute clip around how to protect trans women, because I had sent her a message saying, like, I appreciate you and how you say what needs to be said out there in Hollywood. I don't know how you still do that and have a job, but I appreciate you. And I think I can say this to you. A lot of what's happening to me in that right now is that I'm being celebrated from people who aren't necessarily my community. And then people who are my community feel like I'm the wrong messenger. And so I'm getting really frustrated with this dichotomy. And she put out this video talking about protecting me, mentioning me by name. And then a shift happened almost overnight. Then people started talking about protecting trans women. This whole other sort of movement came from it. And so it's been a challenging, wonderful, beautiful, surprising experience, where folks now want to know like who I am and what I think about the world. And so this new platform that I have, I'm utilizing to get more messages about abolition, to talk about breaking down cancel culture and all the ways that we participate in punishment in ways to heal our communities that don't actually heal us. And so that was pretty much what the speech has done. It's brought many new opportunities to me, which I'm still taking in slowly. But the major piece that came up for me was worthiness. As a trans person, I was like, am I worthy for all these people to follow me? Is it like people are adding my name to a list of these revolutionary people, and I don't feel like I've done enough. And I was sort of reminded that some of these revolutionaries were 19 years old when they started. They were also babies. They were also trying to figure it out. They also didn't know and have all the answers, and made mistakes. And so the best thing about it is that I think that it's put more folks in the conversation of what this movement is actually about, as opposed to what it was co-opted with in the media.
You know, it's interesting that you say that about wondering if you have done enough, you know, because it makes me think of two things. One, I've been doing this activist portrait series since 2015 or 2014. And through this project, I've been drawing these activists 10 feet tall, 12 feet tall. And while I'm, in order to get the image that I'm going to draw, I interview them and take photographs of them while I'm interviewing them. And I've asked all of these activists now, you know, 30, 40, 50 activists about their practice and how they got involved in organizing. And every single one of them says to me, oh, I'm not really like an activist. Like, I don't know if I would be able to say I'm an activist because I'm not sure if I've done enough, you know? So there's like Queen Titi Opaleki, who's one of the first people I drew. She and her son had collected 60,000 prosthetics to be reused elsewhere, because when they found out that her son's prosthetics couldn't be reused in Canada, she was like, but there's places all over that need prosthetics. So she collected 60,000 of them and had redistributed them around the world, but she wasn't sure that she had done enough to be considered an activist, right? So there's this myth that we have out there of this sort of hyper super activist that is doing all of the things all of the time, never sleeping. And I think that one, that creates like an unhealthy pedestal that we expect ourselves to somehow live up to. And two, it perpetuates a culture of sort of working until you're burnt out and then once again sort of disappeared from the community because you can't participate in organizing because you're burnt out, right? So we need to kind of disrupt that and say, we've done enough, which makes me think second thing, which is that beautiful new work by Anique Jordan that just went up, that it was based actually on an Instagram post that she had created where she said, we have done enough. Like we've done rallies, we've done demos, we've done actions. It's similar to what you said in your speech as well. We've tried to get your attention in all of these different ways, in order to stop the violence that is being directed towards Black people, being directed towards Black mad people in particular. We have done enough to stop this. It is actually now your turn. Right? Like we have done enough. And I think that there are so many artists who are pointing us in that direction. And so I'm thankful for those interventions, but it's so interesting that we still all think, oh, am I doing enough? Even when we're working flat out.
Something that came up for me was that I think it's because we turn people into monuments. Like even in our own revolution, like Martin Luther King, we turned Coretta Scott King, we turn them into these monuments. And then they're people who could do no wrong, have done no harm, have no one could ever compare to, and so just losing John Lewis just the other day. Just like brought into perspective. I was like, he was 19 on that bridge, and thinking about being a 19-year-old fighting for justice, fighting for your life, being a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old, fighting for justice, or, a 30, 35, 36-year-old doing it. It's like you can be revolutionary at any stage. And I think we're at a different time too, where we don't need just one face of a leader. That's also what I was trying to get at. Because everyone's looking for the next Martin Luther King, we're not paying attention to what the people on the ground are actually doing, saying, are making possible, are making happen. The only reason why celebrities and pop stars are talking about activism is because of the work of activists on the ground, and bringing it to the forefront, utilizing media, performance art, all these kinds of things to connect people in different ways, because we know people are attracted to shiny things. And so if we make it shiny, if we wrap it in a bow, then people will pay attention to it. And so I think that we're done with that now. We're done with the wrapping it and making it sort of the Disney version. We just need to tell people exactly like what is happening. So for you, like you helped edit the book, right? You helped edit and create the book. And I think that there's something really fascinating about us writing our own book. That never really happens, that people who are part of the movement actually write a book about themselves and their experiences. So a question that I have for you is like, how did you decide that was something that was necessary? What was the process of like figuring out, oh, we have to edit like what we're gonna do with this book, like the direction, all that kind of stuff? Because you, Sandy, and Rodney like really made this thing happen. So
yeah, and artists are threaded through this book. I mean, we have poetry in here, we have visual art in here. There's the cover photograph is by Paige Gillette out of the Yukon. What? A little representing the North there. But yeah, the idea, we had no idea when we started working on the book that things were going to happen the way that they were going to happen in 2020. Who could have predicted, from January, Australian wildfires, to February, COVID-19 starting to spread around the globe, to the global shutdowns, to the, to the revolution kicking off in June, and all of this activism, and we released our book in February. We would have had no idea that this was what was about to come. But what we did know when we started writing was that it was rare to have an opportunity to tell your own story, right? And we are a community-based movement. The movement for Black Lives is one that is community-driven. It is disability justice rooted. It is queer and trans-led. And we wanted to have an opportunity for the community to tell their own story about what this movement has been like, in the early years of this particular format of this version of the movement, right? And so when we started writing it in 2017, 2018, we turned to community and said, what stories do you want to tell? And necessarily there were stories about art and there were stories about activism, merged together. So we have, Dr. Naila Khalida May, offering poetry, but also offering a critical reflection on the artistic choreography and aesthetics of our sit-in at Pride. There's work by Anik Jordan, reflecting on the Black Lives Matter Toronto Freedom School. There's our conversation about art and activism together in the movement and what that looks like. There's all of these, really great conversations. And there are just such beautiful writers, there's such beautiful creative types in our community who brought out these words to life, and were able to tell a story that needed to be told. I think that, I'm somebody who's very interested in archives, as part of the Marvelous Grounds Collective led by Dr. Jen Harita Warren. For a couple of years, we worked to collect stories of QT BIPOCs in Toronto, and we ended up releasing 2 books that sort of tried to capture those stories, because we realized that, in the absence of telling the stories, particularly stories of Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks, and then, you add in disability and you add in sexuality and gender and all of these things that we want to make sure that we're talking about, that our voices often don't get included in mainstream archives. If you were to go to the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, they're still working to try to diversify their collection to make sure that their collection is reflective of the diversity of Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut, and currently it isn't. If you go to archives all across this part of what is now called Canada, there's big holes, around the racialized stories. And there are amazing artists who are trying to draw attention to that and trying to fill in the gaps. I'm thinking of Deanna Bowen, I'm thinking of Camille Turner, I'm thinking of artists who use archive and memory as part of their practice. But anyways, yeah, there's just, there's so much that that needs to be told that isn't told. And so creating a book while the movement is still happening, that will just be the beginning of the conversation. Documenting it as we go is a way of creating an archive for our children's children, a way of, I think I read so much about the Black Panther Party and that movement for Black lives. And I think about, the writings about Emory Douglas's artistic practice and the writing about the sort of political choreography of their movements. And it's always, usually written by somebody else about them or by themselves, but many, many years down the line, 30 or 40 years later. And how beautiful it was to get to write about the movement from within the movement, real time, as it was unfolding around us. And then look, we end up releasing it right before everything sort of kicks off. And so, of course, now it seems like really important reading, because there's still a lot of people in this country who think that we don't have an issue with anti-Black racism, who think that we don't have an issue with white supremacy, who don't see the roots and the origins of the police force and the RCMP on Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut as being intimately connected to the process of colonization here, and of course the transatlantic slave trade. So there's people who still need help getting there, and so this book might be an opportunity to learn a bit more about what's happened here in Canada. Ravyn, thinking about this movement and thinking about how much has kicked off just since June, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that you've seen the movement use art to mobilize people and engage people.
Sure. I mean, something right off the bat that I think about is the use of social media. It's something that the Black Lives Matter global movement has utilized um, as part of a strategy to get information out there, right? And so that has kicked up a notch because now more people are at home or in places where they have to sit um, with isolation, and for the first time are sort of sitting with like what isolation actually is, connecting us feeling like we have to be at home trying to keep ourselves safe to the people who are in prison and solitary confinement, and to imagine the mental barriers that we are going through right now don't even compare to those who have actually been incarcerated or incarcerated right now, and the lack of strategies, the lack of things that are available to folks once they leave those systems. Um, and so some of the ways that it's happened is that there is more groups of artists coming together to have conversations within their own industries, to talk about anti-Black racism, to talk about um, transphobia in movements, to really like try to pull at some of the things that are happening in real time all over the place. I think um, witnessing George Floyd actually made people stop for a moment to see what we have been fighting against and um, for for 500 years, right? So I just think that there was a massive wake up that 2020 offered us as a global community of folks thinking about climate change. To you mentioned the wildfires. There's fires in LA again, and so we're being constantly asked to reckon with all these different parts of ourselves, with all the ways that we relate to each other, with all the ways we relate to our media, our social devices. I think that a lot of ways people have demonized people, millennials, for being on our social medias. However, in this time period, it is the navigating of those systems that has allowed more information to get out, that has allowed us to mobilize people to get to funds to certain people who need them when they need them, who have been incarcerated in the movement for fighting for Black lives and Black justice. Um, I myself have been asked to write quite a lot. And as a mover, as an artist, um, I've never put a whole lot of intention into words, speaking words. A lot of them just came through my body, like my limbs have the conversation. And so it was the first time I was actually having to sit down and write out what was actually feeling inside, um, linking all these parts of myself together. Um, and has offered me and myself in this time period so much more of a fuller experience. I think that for a long time I was trying to keep my art practice and my activism practice separate. I didn't want to be politically famous, because I don't want fame for protecting my own people. I'm not looking to be the face of any movement. I want to be a star for like my singing and my dancing and my music, that stuff. But I didn't expect it to be the opposite direction. So having people recognize this speech has actually brought more people into looking at my actual artist work. And so it's all woven into one piece right now, and it feels interesting and good. But I feel like that too. Right now, artists are having real conversations about like, what are we doing? What have we been doing? What have we not been doing? And having conversations about, um, because we are not seen as people who are essential workers. But I know, and Syrus, that once this pandemic is over, it is art that's going to bring us through. Art and healing and ways of connecting to our bodies. Those modalities are going to allow us to shift and deal with the trauma and harm of this period of time. And so that's sort of how I understand it weaving. I feel like it's always done that. I think we're just more aware of it now.
Yeah, and it makes me think a little bit about, this moment right now where, as you say, artists are asking themselves, where am I in this movement? What have I done? How is my practice in service of the kinds of changes that people are saying are desperately needed? And so we saw when we painted that mural in front of police headquarters, 80 artists come out and get dirty and just really help us to spread this message. But I'm also seeing activists saying, wait a minute, we need more artists in our movement. So it's not just that artists are becoming more politicized in their practice, or that there's a move towards bringing politics into artistic practice in ways that maybe people haven't. A lot of people have been doing that for literally decades, but there are people who this is a newer phenomenon for them. But then they're also seeing, arts moving more and more centrally into this movement for Black lives. And so with Black Lives Matter, it has always been an arts-led movement, but there are so many new groups that are popping up everywhere, and they're bringing arts into it. So I think about, that moment in Montreal, the moment where the John A. MacDonald statue comes down. And of course, there's artists who have been integral to this design, to this choreography that they've created, because they've used the banners. They used banners that were created by artists, right, to surround the base in order to do the choreography that was necessary for the toppling of this, white supremacist statue. And then, is this not performance art? Is this not the most beautiful performance art to see this unexpected moment happen? And then as it is with performance art, the unexpected moment where you don't know what's going to happen when it hits the ground, but of course the head popping up, and it was just this, you just couldn't have scripted it. So I think that is a performance, in the same way that Rodney writes about in his chapter in Until We're Free, about the choreography of the demonstration, and about the choreography of a march, and I think that this is performance art that we're seeing, these actions where dramatic, quick things happen, that are unexpected. And so I'm really excited to see how that is happening within the movement, and how the movement is also influencing artists in the contemporary art scene. So I know that we don't have a ton more time. We have about 10 minutes, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about where we're headed, because of course, as we know, you've mentioned several things just now. Of course, climate change. We're in the middle of this pandemic. The movement for racial justice is vast. Capitalism is sort of heaving its last and sort of final breaths. We're in this moment of profound systems change. As artist and activist Octavia Butler told us, this would be a time of profound change, and lo and behold, it is. So in this moment when so much is changing, I wanted to ask you, 2 or 3 generations down the road, thinking back at this moment about the kind of art that's being created, what do you want people to know about being an artist in this moment? If you were to think of your sort of children's generation looking back on the art of this moment, what would you want them to know about being an artist, being alive, being engaged in the movement right now? This time like no other, this 2020.
What is wild is that is why I'm called the Black Widow, because as a burlesque artist, I choose to do performances and stories that are reminders of what people have forgotten. They are ways of letting folks know what it takes for me to leave my home, or for trans folks to be in places where we have our own families and our own relationships and our own loves, and are successful. And so I think about it all the time. I think, something that's landed on me recently is thinking about myself as an ancestor. And so as an artist ancestor, I am doing work that hopefully won't need to be done in 3 generations. It's like like drilling it and making it possible and making everything about my art about this moment and shifting the mentalities that we have and are born into and really have to um, come to terms with, um, so that in 3 generations they don't have to be doing that. They can just make art about being free. They can just, all the stuff that we call cheesy. They can make art about peace, love, desire, sexuality, sensuality, and sex that isn't shamed. All the ways in which people deserve to be liberated is why I do art, and I hope is where art is going. I think Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism is a way forward. It's a way to think about how to change and move in this time period. How
Well,
about you, Sai? What are you thinking?
Well,
Um,
Walida in Marisha says that all activism is speculative fiction because we're daring to imagine that another world is possible. So, as an activist, we are speculative fiction writers. We are speculative fiction performers, and yeah, I want people to know how electric this moment feels, the sheer sense of possibility that is manifested right now. I mean, I cannot tell you, I've been working as an abolitionist for 25 years, and to wake up in June and read an article in Cosmo magazine about abolition, I was like, what is even happening? We literally, they always told us we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. Well, I mean, imagine, right? Like, imagine living in a moment where we might finally be able to abolish slavery, which was negatively abolished but continued through the prison system and the policing system. Imagine if we were able to create a world post-pandemic, that ensured that everybody had housing, everybody had food, everybody had, support, so that, as you said, Ravyn, they could just make art because they were free. I think about that Asada Shakur and Asian Dub Foundation song, Committed to Life. And in it, she says that she's a struggler, but she's a reluctant struggler and a reluctant warrior because she would rather be a gardener, a sculptor, a baker, a carpenter, but instead she's a struggler because she's committed to life. So I think, imagine if we got to create the kind of world where for our children's children, they got to be the sculptor and the gardener and the baker, and they could dance in the streets, and they could write poems on the back of maple leaves, and they could be completely free. I mean, imagine that. That is what we're shoulder to shoulder in the struggle, working to fight for. And Ravyn, I'm so thankful to be in the struggle with you. I mean, watching your art practice flourish and being able to be an artist alongside you is a really beautiful thing. So I'm very thankful.
I'm thankful too, Sai. You inspire me in all the ways, all the ways. I appreciate you, your work, your dedication, commitment, the way you hold us all accountable to abolitionist principles. Um, and yeah, really sits very deeply with me. I appreciate you so very much. And this moment to be able to have conversations about artists. I think that, I was saying this about dance specifically, how dance has divorced itself from politics, from speaking truth to power, because because it turned into making people feel good. And I think that art can make you feel good, art can make you responsible, art can make you more honest. I think you can do all of those things. And I think that in this time of this new resurgence of this Black Renaissance, um, that's what we're being called to do. We're engaging with ourselves in real human decency, understanding that COVID-19 has shown us that we are actually all very much connected. The fact that we aren't polluting the air right now means that animals that we thought were extinct are coming back. There are places that are growing green and lush without our traffic. And so we need to think about that as things start to open, as people want to get back to normal. I hope we never get back to that kind of normal. I hope we get to a different place where we're respecting ourselves and our land, each other, in ways that we had before colonization.
I mean, the land is our greatest teacher, right? And it is so beautiful to imagine a world where the earth also gets to be free. Thank you.
That part.
Stephanie, thank you so much for the chance to have this conversation.
Well, I'm just blown away. As always, Syrus, you are a huge inspiration to me. And Ravyn, I have been following your work for a while, and this conversation is just the way that I wanted to kick off this academic year, to think about my new home at McMaster and at the School of the Arts. I'm blown away by concepts like make the revolution irresistible, and Ravyn's filling that out with this notion that revolutionary acts are bodily, they're danceable, the choreography of the toppling of the monuments. There's kind of an intimacy in the descriptions that you're talking about, but also this reminder that there is this long history of the arts in revolutionary acts, but that we also need to remember that what those art forms are not always the ones that we teach in the canon in our art schools. I'm also really struck by this, you've done enough, that there is enough. And for me, that really makes me want to remember that my place in all of this, and the School of the Arts and McMaster's place, and now we need to take up these kinds of calls and allyship and work on the revolution in pedagogy, in curriculum, and in institutional structures. So you've given us so much to think about in terms of care and healing. And then these closing remarks about the ancestors of the future, gardening and cooking and not having to topple monuments. And so I'm really, this kind of creating a new archive for future generations of children, of students, of colleagues, etc. So I'm just so grateful to both of you for this today. Wow, what a way to start the school. I'm just going to reiterate, because the live stream had a little glitch and a little delay, and so our introductions were missing. So I just wanted to put out there for the 220 people watching from around the world that this was a talk or roundtable discussion. Artists for the Revolution, Creative Activisms in the Movement for Black Lives. And our guests today were Syrus Marcus Ware, an assistant professor at McMaster University. He's just come to join us. And in conversation with Ravyn, Ariah, Wngz, an artist, dancer, choreographer, activist, working to change all the hierarchical structures in mainstream art and dance spaces. So, and this was put on today by the School of the Arts at McMaster University. And again, like, just a huge thank you to everybody who has come today, you know, in the evening after many other things that you've been doing with your day and in the moment of needing self-care in the pandemic. But thank you, both of you. Thank you so much for this generous time.
Thank you as well. I appreciate the opportunity always.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ravyn.
And thanks for everyone in the virtual room who's been hanging out with us through this conversation.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody behind the scenes. I need to say thank you to my my team of technicians that have been behind the scenes doing this